Genesis 6 is the beginning of the flood story, and Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is the passage that introduces something for Christians. And for me, when I started to get back into Christianity and looking at the Bible and studying it closely, it created a bit of mental cognizant dissonance in my mind when I'm there for prophecy and I'm coming across this passage that is talking about sons of God, fallen angels that are procreating with human females to create giants. And it's the context and the preamble for the flood story. And I'm going, I don't want anything to do with that when I first read it. And I get it. And Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is probably one of the most, if not the most controversial passage sort of within Christianity, with most of mainstream Christianity saying it doesn't say what you're reading. And the other part that is saying, well, it does. And there's so many other passages that relate to it that verify its veracity, and that it is something that if most Christians were, if they bring it up in their churches, they're actually asked to leave or not to ask the question again.
Wow. It's true. It's true. They don't want to touch it. So the idea that these fallen angels took as wives, either through coercion, force, through some sort of negotiation, took the daughters of men, who then conceived these offspring that became known as the Nephilim, that they were in fact giants. This is disputed by many. Are we actually talking, or where is the scriptural evidence, or outside of the Bible even, if we're talking about ancient Hebrew, or evidence that what we're really talking about here are giants?
Yeah, so if you're reading a modern translation Bible, it will say Nephilim in Genesis 6:4. And if you're reading the King James Version Bible, it will say giant. And giant goes back to a Hebrew word, Nephil. And the I am is the male plural. And it's defined in what I call the concordance, that is the definitions to the words of Hebrew that's translated into English from the original Masoretic text for the King James Version, for example. That word is defined as a tyrant, as a bully, a giant, and giants, as in giant tribes. And so a lot of people will say, well, you have to be careful in terms of how you translate that. And that's absolutely true, because Hebrew and Greek has multiple meanings. So you have to select the right passage for the verse and that it fits within the passage, the chapter, and there aren't any other conflicts in Scripture. So if you look at the word tyrant, that goes back to tyrannos, which was the word that evolved back through, and I cover this off in book 2, of the Gyges kings, which were tyrannos. And these were the Gyges kings that were descendants of giants in a dynastic order, and one specific line that came from the Herculides, or Hercules, son of Zeus, as a specific sort of patriarch. And so tyrannos and Gyges is part of the meaning. So they were tyrant kings as we sort of understand that. And that Gyges, or Gyes in the plural, is the source word for Greek and giant. So you have gigantes, a lot of people sort of look back, and that's also rooted in Gyges, with the Gigas transliterated into English, and ES turns that G to a Y. So Gyges singular, Gyes plural, gigantic singular, gigantes as they're known in other giant creatures in Greek mythologies in the plural, and an order of giants that were created. So it's associated from those two words, or with tyrannos and Gyges in throughout history and polytheist history. And also there's another word in there that's bull, or a bully, because bully derives from bull. And in the Ugaritic text for the Rephaim, which are the post-Diluvian giants that Baal and Ashtaroth created, Not only were the gods like Baal, Ashtaroth, and the parent god El called bulls, but so were their spurious offspring, were dynastic kings, giants. And so the Canaanite pantheon is the pantheon that's talked most about in the Bible. So we can take that as a direct parallel, and the Ugaritic text runs very, very close with its analogy of the Baalim gods from the Council of Gods on Mount Hermon and the creation of the giants, and how that overlaps into RPM, which is a Semitic word for Rephaim for Hebrew, which are the post-Diluvian giants. So any way you look at that word, it means giant. And then Rephaim also means giant, and also has extension words that are spirit, evil demon, and also healing is the root word, all parts of the meaning of Rephaim, because they were thought to have healing powers or self-healing powers, just like the Merovingian kings or the Fisher King concept in polytheism had that healing sort of quality to it. And it's one of the reasons why you have to take the head of a giant, is because that healing quality. So the demon aspect is the disembodied spirit of a giant once it's been killed. And then, of course, the giant, as it's described as a giant, means exactly that. So how do we know these giants were large? So let's do a couple of accounts on that. So in the Bible, we get Goliath, which I think everybody might be familiar with, and he's listed as 6 cubits and a span. And he was the king of Gath, one of 5 kings at the time of the duel between David. And David takes 5 smooth stones because he thinks he might have to kill 5 giant kings that day. And not that he's going to miss. So once he fells Goliath, he chops his head off. It's part of the whole sort of connections. And so 6 cubits as a royal cubit at 21 inches and a span of 6 inches would make him 11 feet 3 inches tall. Wow. And even if it was a standard cubit, he would be about 9 feet tall. So not, I mean, giant-like, but that wouldn't be giant, but as a king. And Josephus says to measure these giants on a royal cubit because they are a royale. And so the bed that Og had was 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide. He's the last of the Rephaim. You'll see that word giant used a lot in the Old Testament. It goes back to Rapha, except for 3 times when it's Nephilim. And 1 time to Gibborim, which is also connected in the book of Joshua. So this bed was made of metal because it wouldn't carry his weight. He was the king of Edrei and Ashtaroth of Mount Hermon, and Ashtaroth is the mother goddess of the Rephaim. And so again, you see the connections that are starting, how you can link the Ugaritic text with the biblically and get similar related stories. And so Og his bed would be close to 16 feet tall, 7 feet wide, made of iron. So that would make him somewhere between 12 and 15 feet high and say 4 to 6 feet wide, somewhere in that zone. So that 2-to-1 dimension that is classified within the dimensions of 9 and 4 cubits is the sort of the understanding of stout in the Old Testament in terms of the KJV, which is describing these giants. So they had a 2-to-1 height to width ratio for the most part, versus a 3-to-1 for humans. And so they were very muscularly wide and large. And so I would put them at somewhere, as I say, somewhere 12 to 14 feet tall and say 4 to 5.5 feet wide. Outside the Bible, we get giants like Orontes or Achilles, and you could go through a number of them. They range 12 to 13 feet tall. So again, in that range where Og is, but then we get one that's in the Ugaritic text, that's in the Sumerian text, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and many others, and it has a constant dimension for Gilgamesh, son of Lugalbanda, 6th generation after the flood. So son of Lugalbanda and the mother goddess Nin, and he is 11 cubits tall and 7 cubits wide. So 4 cubits wide. So he's 7 feet wide and 19 feet tall as a royal cubit. And that is the largest one that I have for a sort of a size after the flood. And he's a dark-haired giant. So he's a different kind of post-diluvian giant than the red-haired, blonde-haired, hazel-eyed, blue-eyed giants that are discussed in the land of the covenant or the Holy Land and in the Bible. So there's a couple of different kinds. And what's also important to keep in mind is that the giants before the flood were larger.
Okay. So let's talk about the post-diluvian giants, or the second incursion. And in Genesis 6, it talks about there were giants on the land in those days and after, meaning after the flood. Are there any clues in Scripture as to how this second incursion took place, if we are to understand that the first apocalypse, or the flood, was basically to clean the gene pool, as it were, and wipe out the giants? How did the second incursion take place?
Yeah, so there's really only two ways you see giants after the flood. One is somehow they survived the flood, and there's a few different theories out there, and I'm open to those. I lean more to a second incursion because it fits better. But we don't get that super smoking gun verse like Genesis 6:1-4 after the flood, although it's certainly, when you look at the Hebrew text, that when it's talking about that the sons of God came again, we just don't know to the extent of that. Obviously more before the flood, but also probably again after the flood. And so there seems to be a few more restrictions and things that are going on in terms of the giants. They're not as big, they don't live as long, things like that. They have powers, but not seemingly the same kinds of powers. So biblically, when we look at how these giants show up, we have to sort of look at passages that would describe a scenario where that might happen. So when we look at Jude 1:6 and 2 Peter 2, you have passages that are connecting the sins of the fallen angels with Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what's interesting about that is, out from outside biblical texts, is you have the Gnostics, who have an account about the creation of giants that were created at Gomorrah before the flood, and then Sodom replanted after the flood. And so now when you look at this filthy conversation, as the King James Bible describes it, that's going on between Lot and the people of Sodom, is that they're wanting these angels that they recognize as angels to come out and have sex with them. And these are equated with the same types of crimes as before the flood. So we typically sort of understand that as homosexuality from a biblical perspective. And that would be part of the crimes, as the book of Lamech of Cain and other sources outside the Bible say was a common trait of the giants before the flood, and by inference after the flood. And perhaps the crime, when you look at what Ham did to Noah after the flood, and the curse of Ham that falls on Canaan, who are the Canaanites who are going to live amongst the giants to try and get rid of that curse, all things I cover off in book 2, you could interpret that as either a sexual attack on Noah's wife biblically, or on Noah, but more likely Noah, because he's the one who's addressed. And when those laws, and this is sort of long on the minutiae of it, when they're talking about uncovering somebody, the person is named. And even though it will be an uncovering of the spouse as well, the crime usually is attributed to the one that's named, and it's Noah that is named. And so he's the one who realizes what has happened when he wakes up from his drunken stupor. And, that's when he issues this prophetic curse on Ham, but it doesn't take place with Ham. It's going to take place with Canaan. And so this is a common trait amongst the giants, both before and after the flood. And probably even more so after the flood, because of a fertility issue that is part of the Rephaim, and why they're going to need to intermarry with humans. It's kind of a different sort of rabbit hole here. So when we look at the second incursion then, and bringing this sort of full circle and back to the Sodom narrative, my point is that this is Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain were the cities of the giants from before the flood and also after the flood. And they're ruled over by giant Rephaim kings. And this is a city in Pentapolis that worships the Canaanite pantheon of Baal and Ashtaroth, offspring gods ruling after the flood. El would have been the one before the flood as a parent god, and that they had created these giants. And so they were very familiar with this concept, and that the angels could take a form and a gender of their choice. So the question gets to be in that passage with this filthy conversation and the crimes being the same as angels, were they wanting to have the angels to have sex with females from that city, or did they want them to change gender and to have sex with the men to create giants? Because just as in the Ugaritic text, they're doing fertility issues for Baal and Ashtaroth to come back, and they're in the pit prison by this point for the same crimes as the parent gods did after the flood to reproduce giants, because they have that fertility issue. And it may be a little bit of both going on there. So you have all of this sort of knowledge and information about the giants that are located in that area, whom the Canaanites intermarried with, and the Rephaim were the kings, and that they were worshiping these gods who created the giants, that knowledge would be well known and well understood. And yet they wanted to have sex with these angels. So it's a matter of the format, and it might be all of the above, or it might be specifically to create the new giants, but it's equated, and that's the key. And so in the days of Noah is when the giants were created, and that reference is a constant for those as a defining scriptural annotation for the crimes of the angels before the flood and then after the flood.